I am Maya, 34 years old, and I am currently recovering from my family. As a financial strategist, I have spent years quietly building my wealth, escaping their toxicity, while occasionally stepping back into the lion's den out of duty. Before continuing this story, let me know where you started reading in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have ever faced family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Fairfield, Connecticut, meant being privileged to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and heated pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never meet. My childhood bedroom became my sanctuary from the constant judgment. From elementary to high school, I maintained my upright character while participating in student councils, but none of it mattered. I was always the scapegoat, the disappointment who refused to play their social games. But it was last Sunday, during what was supposed to be a standard family dinner, that the final thread holding us together snapped. The heavy crystal water goblets clinked against the mahogany table, the only sound cutting through the suffocating tension in my parents' dining room. My older sister Chloe, wearing a custom designer dress that cost more than my first car, reached into her handbag. Beside her sat her elitist white husband, Bradley, an investment broker, who always looked at me like I was something he had scraped off his shoes. Chloe did not say a single word as she slid a crisp white piece of paper across the polished wood. It stopped right next to my dinner plate on the table. I looked down at the document. It was an unpaid invoice for $9,600. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It is the remaining balance for Brittany's Sweet 16 venue," Chloe said, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "The final deposit is due tomorrow morning. We need you to wire the money tonight." She did not ask. She demanded. There was no pleas, no hesitation, just the absolute expectation that I would open my wallet on command. "You want me to pay almost 10 grand for your daughter's birthday party?" I asked, looking from Chloe to Bradley. "Why is Bradley's massive investment firm not paying out those million-dollar bonuses he always brags about at church?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing a red. "My capital is tied up in a commercial project right now, Maya. It is a cash flow issue, not a wealth issue. You would not understand how investments work." "I understand basic math," I replied coldly. "If you do not have the cash, you do not book a $10,000 venue." My father, Deacon Marcus, slammed his fist down on the table, making the silverware rattle. As a prominent figure in our church community, his image was everything. To him, keeping up appearances was more important than truth. "You will watch your tone in this house, Maya," my father boomed. "Your sister is trying to give your niece a celebration fitting for our family's standing in the community. Do you want the entire congregation gossiping about us? Do you want people whispering that Deacon Marcus's granddaughter had her Sweet 16 in a cheap community center? You are a single woman with no husband and no children to provide for. What else are you doing with your paycheck? You will pay this invoice tonight to protect this family's good name." I picked up the invoice, feeling the paper between my fingers. I looked at the venue name printed, the Grand Crest Estate. Then I looked right into my sister's face and pushed the bill back across the table. "I am not funding this facade, Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Just like I am not paying off Bradley's overdue golf club fees like I had to do 5 years ago, so your lavish wedding would not be canceled. Remember that I drained my savings account to save you from public humiliation then, and you did not even put me at the head table. I am done being your secret ATM, eh?" Chloe gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. "How dare you throw the past in my face? That was a loan. A loan you never paid back," I corrected smoothly, refusing to break eye contact. "So no, I am not paying for the Grand Crest Estate. Get a job, Chloe. Or better yet, tell your highly successful husband to liquidate his imaginary assets." My father stood up, his chair scraping. His face was a mask of fury. If you walk out of this room without paying that bill, you are no longer a part of this family. I will disown you, Maya. You will not be welcome in my church, and you will not be welcome in this house. You will be dead to us. I stood up slowly, grabbing my purse from the back of the chair. That is the best offer you have made me in 34 years. I turned and walked out the front door, leaving their outraged shouts echoing behind me. When I reached my car, I sat and pulled out my phone. I pulled up a copy of the invoice I had snapped a picture of under the table. The Grand Crest Estate. A cold, genuine smile spread across my face as I stared at the logo. I dialed a number I knew by heart. "Hello, David," I said when my lawyer answered on the second ring. "It seems my dear brother-in-law Bradley just booked a party at my new venue. Yes, the estate my holding company just acquired for cash last month. He apparently gave them a significant initial deposit. I want you to look into his escrow accounts immediately. Let us see exactly whose money he is really trying to spend right now." The leather seat of my car felt cold against my back as I flipped open my laptop. The streetlights overhead cast long shadows across the dashboard. I connected to the secure network and logged directly into the administrative portal for the Grand Crest Estate. My holding company had finalized the purchase of the luxury venue just 30 days ago. My family had absolutely no idea. To them, I was just a mid-level paper pusher. I bypassed the authentication and pulled up the events calendar. There it was, Brittany's Suite 16. The reservation was booked under Bradley's name. I clicked on the billing tab, and a bright red notification immediately flashed across the screen. The initial deposit check for $9,600 had been returned. Insufficient funds. A sharp laugh escaped my lips. Bradley was the hotshot white investment broker who supposedly managed millions. He drove a leased Porsche and wore bespoke suits, yet he could not even clear a basic event deposit. But the real issue was not just a bounce check. I squinted at the screen, analyzing the routing and account numbers listed on the failed transaction. My background as a financial strategist kicked in immediately. I recognized the bank and the specific format of the account string. This was not a standard personal checking account. This was a corporate escrow account. Bradley was using his clients' investment funds to pay for personal expenses. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was David, my corporate attorney. I answered on the first ring. David did not waste time with pleasantries. He confirmed exactly what I was looking at. The account Bradley tried to use was heavily monitored, and it was currently bleeding cash. Bradley was shifting money from new investors to pay off old ones and skimming off the top to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was drowning in debt. The $9,600 my family demanded from me was not just for a party. It was the exact amount Bradley needed to replace the client funds he had already stolen before the bank flagged the transaction. They were using me as an unwitting accomplice to cover up federal wire fraud. Before I could even process the magnitude of Bradley's incoming federal charges, my phone screen shifted to an incoming call. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Eleanor. I swiped to answer, placing her on speakerphone. I did not even get a chance to say hello. "You are an absolute disgrace to this family," my mother shrieked. Her voice echoed sharply in the quiet confines of my car. "Your father is inside having chest pains because of your disrespect. You are 34 years old, Maya. You are a selfish spinster who sits alone in a house all day. You know nothing about the sacrifices required to maintain a family's standing. Chloe married well. She secured a man who elevated our status, and you are trying to humiliate her over pennies." I stared out the windshield, watching a leaf flutter across the glass. "Pennies?" I asked. "If it is just pennies, why is the millionaire broker begging the spinster for a handout?" "It is a temporary cash flow issue," she screamed, repeating Bradley's lie verbatim. "Family steps up when things get tight. You have no husband, no children, and no loyalty. You are dead to me until you wire that money." She slammed the phone down. The dial tone buzzed loudly before the line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. A suffocating tightness gripped my chest. Her words were meant to break me, to force me back into my designated role as the family scapegoat. It was the exact same tone she used 15 years ago. I remembered sitting in our cramped kitchen, staring at my bank statements in absolute horror. I had worked 3 jobs in high school to save for my college tuition, but when I went to pay my first semester's bill, the account was empty. My mother had forged my signature and drained every single dollar. When I confronted her, she used the exact same justification. She told me family came first. She had taken my college money to buy Chloe a custom hand-beaded debutante gown and fund a lavish coming-out party. Chloe needed to attract a high-society husband, my mother had argued. My education was a secondary priority. I had to drop out, take out predatory loans, and rebuild my life from scratch. Now history was repeating itself. But this time, I held all the cards. I turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my laptop. David had sent over a preliminary background trace on Bradley's accounts. I opened the encrypted file and began scrolling through the transaction logs. If Bradley was stealing from his clients, I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. My eyes scanned lines of data tracking the frantic movement of money in and out of his failing firm. Then a specific line item caught my eye. The cursor hovered over a completed wire transfer process just 48 hours ago. It was a massive influx of cash. $25,000 had been quietly deposited into Bradley's personal checking account. I traced the routing number back to its origin, assuming it was another defrauded investor. The screen refreshed, displaying the registered name of the sending institution. My breath hitched in my throat. My hands went completely numb. The $25,000 did not come from an investor. The transfer originated directly from the Emmanuel Church Building Fund. The exact fund my father, Deacon Marcus, had spent the last 2 years aggressively pressuring the congregation to support. Elderly parishioners had given their fixed incomes to repair the church roof. Instead, my father had embezzled $25,000 of holy offerings and wired it to his white son-in-law to cover up a collapsing Ponzi scheme. My father was not just protecting his high society image. He was a co-conspirator. The gravity of that $25,000 transfer hung over me like a suffocating cloud the entire drive to my parents' house the next evening. I pulled my 10-year-old sedan into a driveway overflowing with imported luxury vehicles. Tonight was the rehearsal dinner for Brittany's Sweet 16. It was an exhibition. I walked through the heavy oak front doors and was immediately hit by the clinking of crystal flutes and the overly loud performative laughter of Bradley's parents. Richard and Margaret were old money, the kind of wealthy white elites who treated my African-American family like an amusing charity project they had generously sponsored through marriage. I had barely taken my coat off when Chloe materialized in the foyer. She wore a smug, self-satisfied grin, her hand extended palm up before I could say hello. She looked me up and down, taking in my simple black sheath dress with a barely concealed sneer. "I knew you would come to your senses," Chloe said, wiggling her fingers impatiently. "Did you bring the cashier's check? Bradley's firm is just so tied up in major acquisitions right now. Hand it over, Maya, and maybe Dad will let you sit at the main table tomorrow." I looked at her outstretched hand and felt a deep wave of pity mixed with disgust. She honestly believed her own lies. She was perfectly content living in a house of cards, unaware that a hurricane was currently brewing right off her coastline. "I did not bring a check, Chloe," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I came for the dinner. Is Mom serving her famous roast?" Chloe's hand dropped. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits of pure venom. "You have incredible nerve showing your face here empty-handed. Dad is going to absolutely destroy you." "Let him try," I replied calmly, walking past her toward the formal dining room. The dining table was a battlefield disguised as a celebration. My father sat at the head, laughing too loudly at a terrible joke Richard had just made. My mother fluttered around Margaret, practically bowing as she refilled the woman's wineglass. When I pulled out a chair near the end of the table, the conversation died instantly. My father glared at me, his jaw clenching clearly, calculating whether to throw me out or maintain the illusion of a happy family in front of his wealthy in-laws. He chose the latter, forcing a tight, artificial smile. Margaret leaned forward, adjusting her diamond necklace. She looked at me with that familiar blend of pity and utter condescension. Maya, darling, she drawled, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Chloe tells us you are still working that little accounting job in the city. You must find it so tedious compared to what our Bradley does. I picked up my water glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip. I work in financial strategy and corporate acquisitions, Margaret. It is actually quite thrilling when you know where to look. Richard let out a booming laugh. Financial strategy. That is adorable. Maybe Bradley can give you some pointers on wealth management. He just closed a massive real estate portfolio. You know, handling millions of dollars takes a pedigree. It is not meant for someone playing with calculators in a cubicle. My mother chimed in, eager to appease Richard. Maya has always preferred to play it small and safe. She never had Chloe's ambition or tastes. Just look at what she wore tonight to a dinner. Margaret sighed in mock sympathy, her gaze raking over my modest attire. Well, not everyone is cut out for the luxury lifestyle. It takes a certain breed to understand high-value investments. You should let Chloe take you shopping, Maya. A good outfit can disguise a multitude of shortcomings. The sheer audacity of these people sitting in my parents' dining room eating food paid for by embezzled church funds and lecturing me about wealth was intoxicating. Bradley sat across the table, swirling his expensive scotch, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He thrived on my humiliation to play the benevolent savior. I set my water glass down. I looked directly at Margaret, then shifted my gaze to Bradley. A slow, razor-sharp smile stretched across my face. You are absolutely right, Margaret, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. I do play it safe. I prefer investing in assets, not outfits. Isn't that right, Bradley? Like your highly volatile escrow investments? The entire room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the central air conditioning. Bradley's hand froze in midair. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His eyes widened in absolute unfiltered terror. He knew exactly what those words meant. My father frowned, clearly missing the specific financial implication, but sensing the sudden shift in power. "What on earth are you talking about, Maya?" he demanded. "Stop speaking in riddles and show some respect to your brother-in-law." I did not break eye contact with Bradley. I watched a bead of sweat form at his temple. "Just talking shop, Dad. Right, Bradley?" Bradley swallowed hard. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He abruptly pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "Maya," he croaked out, his voice devoid of its usual arrogant swagger. "Can I speak with you in the kitchen, please?" Chloe looked frantically between her husband and me. "Bradley, what is going on?" "Nothing, Chloe," he snapped. He turned back to me, his eyes pleading. "Maya, please." I stood smoothing my skirt. I walked past the bewildered faces of Margaret and Richard, past my scowling mother, and followed Bradley into the kitchen. As soon as the swinging door closed behind us, Bradley spun around like a cornered animal. His hands were trembling as he gripped the edge of the granite countertop. "What do you know?" he hissed. I winked. "See you at the party." I pushed through the swinging kitchen door, completely ignoring Margaret loudly complaining about the catering staff to my mother, and headed straight for the front foyer, desperate for a breath of fresh, untainted air. My hand had barely touched the cold brass doorknob when a heavy, familiar grip clamped down hard on my shoulder. It was the unyielding hold my father used when parading a newly baptized parishioner. I turned around slowly to face Deacon Marcus. His jaw was rigidly set, and his dark eyes burned with a volatile mixture of righteous authority and desperate panic. "My study," he ordered in a low, gravelly whisper that brooked no argument. "Now." I followed him down the carpeted hallway to his private sanctuary. The study was exactly as it had been for 20 years, a monument to his ego. Framed photographs covered every available surface. There were pictures of Chloe winning pageants, Chloe marrying Bradley, and my father shaking hands with local politicians. There was not a single photograph of me. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the space. My father walked behind the desk. He forcefully yanked open the top drawer and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder. He slammed it down on the polished wood surface with a loud crack, sliding a heavy gold-plated fountain pen right next to it. "Sit down, Maya," he commanded, gesturing sharply to the leather guest chair. I remained standing. "I prefer to look you in the eye when you attempt to extort me," I replied evenly. My father's nostrils flared. He spun the document around so it faced me directly. I leaned forward just enough to read the bold capitalized header printed at the top of the page. It was a home equity line of credit transfer agreement, accompanied by a deed relinquishment form. The property listed was my modest three-bedroom townhouse. "Bradley is facing a temporary liquidity crisis," my father stated, his voice taking on that familiar booming cadence he reserved for Sunday morning sermons. "He needs a sudden injection of capital to secure his current portfolio. Your sister is in distress. You are going to sign over the equity of your home to Bradley's firm as collateral." I stared at the paperwork, genuinely marveling at his absolute audacity. "You want me to surrender my home to fund a man who uses client escrow accounts as his personal piggy bank?" I asked. My father slammed both palms flat on the desk. "You will not speak ill of your brother-in-law. He is a pillar of this community." He took a deep, shaky breath. "You will sign this document tonight, Maya. If you refuse, I will stand at the pulpit this Sunday and denounce you before the entire congregation. I will tell the elders you have turned your back on your own flesh and blood. You will be cut off completely from the only community that has ever tolerated you. You will be a social outcast." The threat of social death was the ultimate weapon in his arsenal. Being denounced by a prominent deacon meant total isolation. It meant hushed whispers in the grocery store and a lifetime of being treated like a pariah. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to cry, to beg, to desperately cling to the fragile approval he had dangled just out of my reach for my entire life. Instead, I reached across the desk and picked up the gold-plated pen. "You want my equity?" I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You want the equity of the house I bought straight out of a nasty foreclosure. Do you remember why I had to buy a foreclosed property, Dad? Do you remember why my credit score was in the low 400s when I was barely 18 years old?" My father looked away, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "The past has no place in this conversation," he muttered defensively. "Oh, but it does," I countered, stepping closer to the desk until I loomed over him. "You took out 5 different credit cards in my name to pay for your deacon initiation gala. You defaulted on every single one. You ruined my financial future before my life even started, all to protect your precious image. I spent an entire exhausting decade digging myself out of the deep hole you buried me in. And now you want the house I built from the rubble to save a white-collar criminal." "It is for the family!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the document. "Sign it, Maya, or so help me God, I will ruin you." He was sweating now. He was a desperate man, clinging to a sinking ship, utterly blind to the fact that he was handing me the exact rope I needed to pull him under. I looked down at the signature line. I did not hesitate. I absolutely did not blink once. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a smooth, elegant flourish. I initialed the bottom corner and pushed the folder back across the desk. My father exhaled a massive breath of relief. A smug, victorious smile spread across his face as he picked up the document. He truly believed that he had completely broken me. He believed his authority had won. "I knew you would finally understand your duty," he said, tapping the folder against the desk. "You may join us back at the table now." I turned on my heel and walked out of the study without looking back. The sound of fake laughter drifted from the dining room, but I walked straight out the front door into the cool night air. I quickly pulled my cell phone from my designer purse as I walked down the dark driveway. I opened a new message to David. My thumbs flew rapidly across the digital keyboard. He signed the confession of his own default. Proceed with the trap. The Grand Crest estate looked breathtaking under the twilight sky. Valet attendants in crisp white uniforms rushed to open the doors of arriving luxury sedans, completely unaware that the woman handing them the keys to a 10-year-old sedan was the sole proprietor of the entire sprawling property. I walked through the gilded double doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over the towering floral centerpieces and the ice sculpture carved into the shape of a swan. My father and Chloe had clearly spared absolutely no expense utilizing the stolen church funds and Bradley's fraudulent transfers to fund this grotesque display of false prosperity. I handed my coat to the cloakroom attendant and grabbed my place card from the silver tray in the foyer. Table 42. I navigated through the maze of tables draped in imported silk linens. As the numbers climbed higher, the table locations grew progressively worse. Table 42 was shoved into the darkest corner of the ballroom, wedged tightly against the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed out with a tray of appetizers, the heavy doors threatened to slam into my chair. It was a deliberate, calculated insult. My family wanted me present just so they could publicly humiliate me, ensuring I knew my place at the absolute bottom of their social hierarchy. I took my seat, ignoring the sympathetic glances from the catering staff, and simply smiled. The irony was incredibly sweet. They had exiled me to the kitchen doors of my own multi-million-dollar property. The music swelled as the guest of honor finally made her grand entrance. My 16-year-old niece Brittany descended the sweeping marble staircase wearing a custom designer gown that shimmered with hundreds of hand-sewn crystals. She paused on the landing, soaking in the applause and the flashing camera lights like a seasoned celebrity. After greeting the prominent guests at the front of the room, she made her way through the tables collecting envelopes and gifts from her adoring audience. It took her nearly an hour to reach the back corner, where I sat sipping sparkling water. Brittany stopped in front of my table. She crossed her arms, looking me up and down, with the exact same disdainful sneer her mother had perfected over the years. She did not bother to say hello or thank me for coming. "Mom said you had to take out a payday loan just to afford a gift." Brittany laughed, her voice carrying over the music. Several guests at the adjacent tables turned their heads, their eyes wide with poorly concealed amusement. "She told me not to expect much from the broke aunt, but honestly, I figured you would at least try to dress up for my sweet 16. That dress looks like it came from a discount rack." I looked at my niece. She was just a teenager, but she was already completely corrupted by the toxic entitlement my family bred. She valued people entirely based on the perceived balance of their bank accounts. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a sleek, unbranded white envelope. I held it out toward her. "I did not take out a payday loan, Brittany," I replied, my voice perfectly level and calm. "No, but I did bring you a reality check." Brittany snatched the envelope from my hand, her manicured nails digging into the paper. She ripped it open, expecting cash. Instead, she pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. It was a high-resolution photocopy of the bounced deposit check her father had written to secure this venue, complete with the bright red, insufficient funds stamp stamped across the front. I had David pull it from the estate's internal billing system earlier that afternoon. Brittany stared at the paper, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She lacked the financial literacy to fully comprehend the document, but she clearly recognized her father's signature and the angry red letters. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice dropping an octave as she held the paper up. "That is the foundation of your entire life," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Enjoy the party, Brittany. It is going to be a very memorable night." She crumpled the paper in her fist and stormed off toward the VIP section, her heavy gown swishing angrily across the polished dance floor. I shifted my gaze to the front of the ballroom. The atmosphere at the main tables was electric. Bradley's highest-profile investors had just arrived, men in tailored suits, accompanied by women dripping in diamonds. Chloe immediately sprang into action. She was practically vibrating with desperate energy, loudly introducing the wealthy newcomers to my parents and the surrounding guests. She was working the room like a politician, ensuring everyone within a 50-foot radius knew exactly how important and connected her husband was. Bradley's firm is revolutionizing the commercial sector, Chloe bragged to a silver-haired investor, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. He just secured another massive international portfolio. We are actually looking at buying a vacation home in Monaco to celebrate. Bradley stood beside her, but he was not smiling. His face was the color of ash. He kept dabbing his forehead with a linen napkin, his eyes darting nervously toward the main entrance. He knew the deadline for his escrow replenishment had passed. He knew the home equity transfer my father forced me to sign was his absolute last lifeline, but he did not yet realize the document was completely invalid because the house was owned by an airtight trust. He was waiting for a financial miracle that was never going to arrive. He looked like a man standing on the gallows listening to the trapdoor creak beneath his expensive leather shoes. I watched them revel in their stolen glory for another brief moment. Then I casually texted the venue security chief to lock the perimeter gates. I slipped my phone back into my clutch just as the heavy double doors of the kitchen swung open, nearly grazing my elbow. A waiter hurried past with a tray of champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the digital trap I had just activated. No one was leaving this property tonight until I was finished with them. I took a sip of my sparkling water and watched the VIP tables. Bradley was still wiping his forehead, looking like a man about to face a firing squad, but Chloe was entirely in her element. She thrived on a captive audience. I watched as she hooked her arm through the elbow of a tall, distinguished man with silver hair. He was Arthur Sterling, the CEO of a massive tech conglomerate, and apparently Bradley's newest target for a capital injection. Chloe was steering him directly toward my dark corner, trailing two other wealthy couples behind them. She wanted a performance. She needed to display her perceived superiority to secure their trust. I could see the greedy glint in her eyes as she paraded her wealthy targets across the dance floor, preparing to use me as her ultimate prop. "Arthur, I simply must introduce you to my younger sister," Chloe announced loudly, her voice piercing the ambient music of the string quartet. She gestured toward me with a manicured hand, her smile a perfect mask of condescending pity. "Maya, stand up and say hello to Arthur and his lovely wife, Beatrice." I remained seated, resting my hands neatly on my lap. I offered a polite, measured smile. Chloe's eye twitched at my refusal to stand, but she recovered instantly, leaning toward Arthur with a dramatic sigh. "My sister struggles financially, but family takes care of family. We insisted she come tonight. We even offered to cover her transportation. It is so important to stay grounded, do you not think? We always try to include Maya in these high society events, so she gets a glimpse of the finer things, even if her own career choices have not exactly panned out." Arthur looked slightly uncomfortable with the oversharing, offering a tight, polite nod. Beatrice clutched her beaded evening bag and offered me a look of pure sympathy, the kind you give a stray dog sitting in the rain. "It must be so difficult for you," Beatrice cooed, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "Seeing all of this success while you work so hard just to make ends meet. Chloe has such a big heart for supporting you." "Chloe has always been remarkably charitable," I replied, my voice smooth as glass. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. Like the time she charitably took the keys to the sedan I worked double shifts at a local diner to purchase. She needed something reliable to drive to her exclusive country club mixers because her own leased convertible had been repossessed. Family takes care of family, right, Chloe? The forced smile on my sister's face instantly shattered. The wealthy investors shifted on their feet, exchanging alarmed glances. The air around our table grew thick and suffocating. Chloe's face flushed a deep, blotchy crimson. She opened her mouth to snap back, to hurl an insult that would put me back in my designated place. But Arthur Sterling stepped closer to the table. He narrowed his eyes, tilting his head as he studied my face in the dim lighting near the kitchen doors. He completely ignored Chloe's sputtering attempts to change the subject, his sharp gaze cutting through her performative outrage. "Wait a minute," Arthur said, stepping past Chloe and extending his right hand toward me. "I know you. We sat across from each other at the Commercial Acquisition Summit in Manhattan last month. You are Maya." I finally stood up, smoothing the front of my black dress, and shook his hand firmly. It is wonderful to see you again, Arthur. I was wondering when you would make the connection. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless laugh, grabbing Arthur's arm to pull him back. Arthur, please do not patronize her. Maya does not attend commercial summits. She is a low-level accountant. She balances spreadsheets for local businesses. Arthur frowned, shaking off Chloe's grip. He looked at my sister as if she had completely lost her mind. Accountant Chloe, your sister is one of the most ruthless and brilliant financial strategists on the East Coast. My firm has been trying to poach her from her holding company for 2 years. Beatrice gasped softly, her eyes darting between me and Chloe. The other investors pressed closer, suddenly extremely interested in the woman sitting by the kitchen doors. My mother, who had just walked over to join the group, stopped dead in her tracks. She stared at Arthur, completely bewildered by his obvious respect for her scapegoat daughter. I think there has been a massive misunderstanding. Arthur continued, his voice booming with authority. He turned back to me, his face breaking into a wide, genuine grin. Maya, I had no idea the new owner of the Grand Crest estate would be here in person tonight. When the real estate journals announced your holding company had acquired this beautiful property for cash 30 days ago, I was absolutely stunned. It is an absolute masterpiece of an investment. Chloe froze in absolute terror. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She stared at me, her mouth hanging open, unable to form a single coherent word. The grand illusion she had spent her entire adult life building was dissolving right in front of her eyes. Owner, Beatrice repeated, looking around the lavish ballroom. You own this entire estate. I do, I confirmed, cheerfully adjusting my napkin on the table. I actually just finalized the deed transfer last month. It is a wonderful venue for events, assuming the clients can actually afford the deposit. I looked past the shocked investors and locked eyes with Bradley. He was standing 20 feet away, frozen in place like a statue. He had heard every single word. He knew I owned the venue. He knew I had seen the bounced check from his fraudulent escrow account. And he knew the gates were locked. Chloe let out a shrill, breathless giggle, desperately attempting to wave away Arthur's revelation, as if he had just told a slightly off-color joke. She grabbed his forearm, her manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Oh, Arthur, you are too funny. Maya, a financial strategist, owning this estate, she can barely balance her own checkbook. You must have her confused with someone else. A very common face, I'm afraid. Arthur pulled his arm free, his expression hardening into cold disgust. I do not make mistakes regarding the people who manage my offshore accounts, Chloe. Maya restructured my entire European portfolio last quarter. She is a genius. He turned his back on my sister, offering his arm to his wife. Beatrice, I believe we have stayed long enough. The air in this corner has become remarkably toxic. As the billionaire couple strode away, taking the other wealthy investors with them, Chloe looked like she was going to hyperventilate. The crown jewel of her social circle had just publicly rejected her in favor of the sister she treated like garbage. Panic flared in her eyes. She needed to regain control of the narrative before the whispers spreading across the ballroom ruined her flawless image. She smoothed her hair, plastered on a rigid smile, and sprinted toward the main stage at the front of the room. She snatched the microphone. Feedback shrieked, silencing the 300 guests. Chloe tapped the microphone, her diamond rings catching the stage lights. Excuse me, everyone, she announced, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it into a smooth, practiced cadence. If I could have your attention, please. It is time for the traditional toast to our beautiful birthday girl. My father nodded approvingly from the head table, completely oblivious to the impending disaster. Chloe launched into a saccharine, tearful speech. She praised Brittany's beauty, her grace, and her imaginary academic achievements. Then, right on cue, she pivoted to her favorite subject, herself. She spoke at length about the sacrifices she and Bradley had made to provide this lavish lifestyle. It takes a truly strong foundation to build a family like ours, Chloe declared, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. She gestured grandly toward Bradley, who was currently sweating profusely and looking frantically toward the locked exits. My perfect husband provides everything we could ever desire. We are so blessed to have a home filled with love, laughter, and children. It is a blessing some people will simply never understand. She paused, locking eyes with me across the vast ballroom. To build a legacy, you have to be selfless. You cannot just focus on yourself living a lonely, childless existence, hoarding every penny while your family needs you. You have to know what truly matters. The pointed insult hung in the air. Guests gasped quietly. My mother looked down at her plate, refusing to intervene as always. They expected me to shrink down in my chair to absorb the public shaming like a sponge, just as I had done every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and birthday for the past 2 decades. I slowly stood up from my seat by the kitchen doors. The room was dead silent, save for the rhythmic clinking of cutlery from the catering staff behind me. I did not rush. I walked with deliberate, measured steps across the polished dance floor, keeping my eyes locked on my sister. The crowd parted for me. When I reached the edge of the stage, I did not stop. I walked up the steps and stepped to the DJ booth behind the podium. "Chloe, you always loved the spotlight," I said, my voice carrying clearly without the aid of a microphone. "Let me help you shine." I pulled my tablet from my clutch. The DJ tried to block the console, but I flashed him a cold look that made him instantly step aside. I plugged my tablet directly into the main audiovisual feed, overriding his laptop with a single swipe of my finger. I stepped away from the booth and turned to face the audience. The giant projector screen behind Chloe, which was supposed to display a touching photo montage of Britney growing up, flashed brilliant white. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The screen did not show a baby picture. It displayed a massive high-definition image of a bank document. It was the deposit check Bradley had written to the venue's holding company 2 weeks ago. The amount was clearly visible in the center, $9,600. But it was the stamp across the front of the check that drew every eye in the room. Insufficient funds. The letters were stamped in bold, angry red ink, magnified to 10 feet tall, behind my sister's perfectly styled head. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar. People were pointing, leaning forward in their chairs, reading the name on the account: Bradley Thornton Associates Escrow. Chloe turned around to see what everyone was staring at. She let out a piercing shriek, dropping the microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud thud. "Turn it off!" she screamed, lunging toward the DJ booth. "Turn that off right now! It is a fake! She fabricated it!" "It is a certified bank record, Chloe," I stated calmly, picking up the fallen microphone. My voice echoed through the chaotic ballroom. "Bradley's firm account is overdrawn by $3 million. He wrote a fraudulent check from a depleted client escrow fund to pay for this party. That is why Dad tried to force me to sign over the equity of my house tonight. They needed my money to replace the funds Bradley stole before the auditors arrive on Monday morning." My father leaped up from his chair, his face purple with rage. "Maya, you shut your mouth this instant," he bellowed. "You are ruining your niece's special night with these vicious lies." I tapped my tablet. "Bradley, you have exactly 10 minutes to leave my own property." The deafening silence broke into a tidal wave of furious whispers. 300 guests turned their heads simultaneously, their eyes darting from the colossal red-stamped failure on the projector screen to Bradley's ashen face. The elite investors at the VIP tables immediately set down their champagne glasses. Their polite smiles vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory calculations of people who suddenly realized they were bleeding money. Bradley snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. His survival instinct finally kicked in, overriding his tailored country club manners. He let out a guttural, desperate yell and sprinted toward the stage. His eyes were wide and frantic, fixed solely on the digital tablet resting on the podium. He intended to rip the device from the console, smash it to pieces, pull the heavy power cords from the wall, absolutely anything to stop the undeniable proof of his financial ruin from glowing brightly above him. He did not make it past the first marble step. 2 broad-shouldered security guards materialized from the dark shadows flanking the stage. They wore crisp black suits and discreet earpieces, moving with terrifying coordinated precision. Bradley crashed into them like a small bird hitting a reinforced window. The lead guard placed a massive, immovable hand flat against Bradley's chest and shoved him backward with effortless, brutal force. Bradley stumbled wildly, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the polished hardwood floor, and fell hard onto his hands and knees. I stood directly above him, gripping the microphone loosely in my right hand. I looked down at my brother-in-law, watching him frantically scramble to adjust his disheveled tuxedo jacket while gasping for breath on the floor. Chloe shrieked his name in horror, abandoning her frozen position near the melting ice sculpture, and ran to his side. She dropped to her knees, clutching his arm protectively, glaring up at me with tears of pure, unadulterated hatred, completely ruining her expensive designer makeup. "You wanted $9,600, Chloe," I asked, my calm voice echoing loudly off the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. "You expected me to drain my own hard-earned savings to cover the deposit for this ridiculous, overblown party. You demanded my equity. I refused because I absolutely do not fund federal crimes." I turned my attention away from my pathetic sister and shifted my gaze directly to the VIP section. Arthur Sterling was already holding his phone tightly to his ear, his face set in a rigid mask of grim determination. "To Bradley's investors," I announced, sweeping my free hand toward the terrified, trembling man on the floor. "Your money is not sitting safely in his highly touted diversified commercial portfolio. It is certainly not generating incredible international returns. It is funding this $600 cake. It is paying for his leased Porsche. It is financing the custom crystal gown my niece is currently wearing, and it is covering the exorbitant country club fees my sister desperately relies on to maintain her fraudulent social status." The elegant ballroom instantly erupted into sheer, unmanageable chaos. The wealthy investors did not hesitate for a single second. Heavy chairs scraped violently against the floor as powerful men and women stood up hurriedly, pulling out their phones to call their legal teams, their forensic accountants, and the local authorities. Beatrice Sterling covered her mouth with trembling hands, stepping quickly away from Chloe, as if my sister carried a highly contagious, deadly disease. Brittany was standing completely paralyzed near the chocolate fountain, her jaw hanging slack as she watched her supposedly loyal teenage friends quickly back away from her in embarrassment. The glittering, affluent world my family had built on a crumbling foundation of outright lies and stolen capital was collapsing in real time. They were completely exposed to the highest echelons of elite society. There was no clever spin, no expensive public relations move, and no desperate lie that could possibly save them from the brutal, undeniable truth currently radiating from the giant projector screen. I felt a deep, profound sense of peaceful vindication washing over my entire body. Years of being called worthless, years of being excluded from every family photo, years of being treated like a shameful secret, all of it beautifully culminated in this single defining moment of absolute justice. I was not the family failure. I was the architect of their long overdue, highly public reckoning. "Stop this blasphemy immediately!" a booming voice roared over the clamor. My father, Deacon Marcus, shoved his way violently through the panicked crowd. His face was contorted with righteous fury, a dark pulsing vein protruding visibly on his forehead. He pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at me. He was utilizing his pulpit voice, the heavy, commanding tone he usually reserved for condemning sinners and demanding absolute obedience from his terrified congregation. "You are possessed by jealousy, Maya," he screamed, his voice cracking with utter desperation. "You are a bitter, spiteful woman trying to destroy your own flesh and blood out of pure, unadulterated envy. Step down from that stage and beg for the Lord's forgiveness." He honestly believed his religious authority still held weight here. He thought he could shame me into submission, just as he had done when I was a frightened teenager begging for his elusive approval. He fully expected me to cower under the crushing weight of his spiritual condemnation. I looked down at the man who had stolen my identity, ruined my credit, and repeatedly sacrificed my welfare to protect his own bloated ego. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt nothing but cold clinical satisfaction. I smiled, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across my face. I raised my left hand and lightly tapped the glowing screen of my tablet. "I am not possessed by jealousy, Dad," I replied calmly. "I am possessed by the undeniable facts." I smoothly clicked the very next digital slide to proceed directly to the next piece of absolutely damning evidence. The massive screen behind the stage flickered briefly before displaying a pristine high-resolution scan of a wire transfer receipt. I had highlighted the most important sections in bright, undeniable yellow ink to ensure maximum visibility from every single angle in the room. The originating account was clearly labeled as the Emmanuel Church Building Fund. The destination was Bradley Thornton's private offshore checking account. The total amount transferred was exactly $25,000. The digital date stamp proved the fraudulent transaction had occurred less than 48 hours before this extravagant Sweet 16 party began. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was entirely shattered by a collective horrified gasp that rippled violently through the assembled guests. The front row of tables specifically reserved for the most prominent members of my father's congregation instantly erupted into chaos. 3 senior deacons and the head elder, men who had known me since I was a small child, stood up so fast their heavy wooden chairs tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. Elder Thomas, a devoted man who had generously donated a significant portion of his meager retirement savings to that specific building fund, pointed a violently shaking finger at the towering projection. His face was completely drained of color, pale as a sheet. He looked rapidly from the glowing screen directly to my father, his expression rapidly transforming from initial shock to profound disgusted realization. The holy facade my father had meticulously maintained for 30 long years was completely annihilated in 10 short seconds. My father staggered backward as if he had been physically struck by an invisible force. The aggressive, commanding posture he had utilized just moments earlier to threaten me completely vanished. He looked like a deflated, terrified old man caught entirely in his own web of deceit. I did not break eye contact with him for a single fraction of a second. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, my voice perfectly amplified by the expensive surround sound system he had rented with stolen money. "You preached to me about family loyalty and faith," I said, ensuring every single person in the room heard the absolute icy contempt radiating in my tone. "You stood in your private study and threatened me with total social exile. You aggressively demanded I surrender my hard-earned home to save this deeply corrupted family. Yet you stole the congregation's roof money to protect a white-collar criminal just to save face at the country club." My father opened his mouth to defend himself, but absolutely no sound came out of his throat. He raised his trembling hands in a weak, placating gesture toward the furious church elders, but they were already turning their backs on him in absolute, unyielding disgust. He had weaponized his religion to shame me for my entire adult life, leveraging his pristine community reputation to cover up his own catastrophic financial failures. Now his profound hypocrisy was broadcast in 50-foot high-definition letters for his entire congregation to witness. The horrific revelation of the stolen church funds was the absolute, undeniable breaking point for Bradley's snooty family. His elite old money parents, who had been sitting in stunned, horrified silence at the main VIP table this entire time, suddenly snapped. His mother, an aristocratic woman who had always viewed my family with thinly veiled upper-class disdain, slammed her half-empty champagne flute onto the table so incredibly hard the fragile crystal stem shattered instantly. She marched directly over to Chloe, her face twisted in a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She completely ignored her own truly miserable son, cowering pathetically on the cold floor nearby. "You greedy, manipulative, social-climbing parasite!" she screamed violently at my sister, her normally refined accent entirely abandoned in her blinding rage. "You completely ruined my son. You intentionally drove him to commit these heinous acts with your endless, pathetic demands for luxury you could never actually afford on your own. You have permanently destroyed the prestigious Thornton name. Bradley's father stepped up right behind his furious wife. His face flushed a dangerous mottled red with pure rage. He aggressively demanded his disgraced son get off the floor and explain the stolen money immediately. The pristine, elegant image Chloe had selfishly sacrificed absolutely everything to project was being violently ripped to shreds by the very people she was most desperate to impress. The wealthy investors she had tried to parade me in front of were already walking rapidly out the double doors, loudly discussing calling the federal authorities. Chloe spun around frantically, surrounded completely by the angry accusing shouts of her wealthy in-laws and the deeply disgusted murmurs of the rapidly departing crowd. Her meticulously planned, ridiculously expensive evening had fully devolved into a spectacular, inescapable nightmare of her own making. She looked wildly at her ruined, weeping husband, then at her absolutely furious in-laws, and finally she locked her crazed, bloodshot eyes directly on me. The sophisticated, benevolent mask she wore so easily in high society completely dissolved, quickly replaced by a feral, unhinged desperation. She roughly hiked up the heavy beaded skirt of her ridiculously expensive designer gown and lunged blindly toward the stage, her face contorted in an ugly tear-streaked sneer. She pointed a violently shaking, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "Security!" Chloe screamed hysterically, her shrill voice cracking painfully as it echoed loudly off the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. She waved her arms wildly toward the perimeter of the ballroom, completely unaware that the venue staff reported solely to my holding company now. "Get her out of my party. I want her arrested for trespassing immediately. Security, remove this lying, jealous failure right now." She was entirely blinded by her own escalating panic and deeply ingrained entitlement. She truly believed she still possessed the authority to command the room, desperately clinging to a shattered illusion of power that absolutely no longer existed for her. The towering head of security detached himself from the shadows near the entrance and strode purposefully down the center aisle. His heavy boots thudded against the hardwood, a steady rhythmic march that momentarily cut through the frantic murmurs of the fleeing guests. Chloe's wet face lit up with a desperate, triumphant smile. She genuinely thought her frantic commands were being obeyed. She stepped aside, smoothing her ruined dress, fully expecting him to grab my arms and drag me out of the ballroom in handcuffs. Instead, the massive man did not even glance in her direction. He walked directly past my sister, brushing past her extended arm, as if she were completely invisible. He ascended the short wooden stairs, crossed the stage, and took his position firmly and respectfully right behind my right shoulder. He crossed his arms over his chest, glaring down at the chaotic room with absolute authority. Chloe's triumphant smile melted into a look of profound, sickening confusion. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to choke out a single syllable. She demanded to know why her hired muscle was refusing a direct order. She screamed that she was the client, the paying customer, the mother of the birthday girl, and the undisputed queen of the evening. She threatened to have him fired, sued, and blacklisted from every event planning agency in the local area. I let her exhaust herself. I let her scream until her voice grew raspy and her lungs burned for oxygen. Only when she paused to catch her breath did I finally make my move. I slowly reached into my sleek designer clutch resting on the podium. My fingers closed around a thick, rigidly folded stack of heavy parchment paper. I pulled the document out and held it up under the glaring spotlight. The official gold seal of the county registrar glinted brightly for everyone in the front rows to see. I unfolded the thick pages with deliberate, agonizing slowness, letting the heavy silence stretch out over the remaining crowd. My sister stared at the papers, her eyes darting frantically between my calm expression and the official legal seal. "You cannot kick the landlord out of her own house, Chloe," I stated, my voice echoing with crushing finality through the vast vaulted room. "I bought this entire estate with cash exactly 3 months ago. Your ridiculous $9,600 invoice was never actually paid. Bradley's fraudulent check bounced, and the previous holding company was ready to cancel this party weeks ago. I quietly purchased the property and assumed the debt just to ensure you would all gather here tonight. You are all trespassing on my private property." The collective gasp from the remaining guests felt like all the oxygen being sucked out of the room. Chloe staggered backward, clutching her chest as if she had taken a physical bullet to the heart. She shook her head in rapid, frantic denial. She stammered that it was entirely impossible. She insisted that I was just a lowly financial strategist, a boring spinster who lived a pathetic, quiet life. She could not fathom that the sister she had relentlessly bullied and belittled for 3 decades possessed the capital to buy an exclusive, expensive dollar country club estate outright. I leaned closer to the microphone, refusing to grant her even a single inch of mercy. I explained that while she was busy maxing out credit cards to buy designer handbags and funding a hollow, superficial lifestyle, I was aggressively investing. I told her that managing Arthur Sterling's European portfolio was merely my day job. My actual wealth came from quietly acquiring highly profitable commercial real estate assets while everyone else was busy trying to look rich on social media. I had built a verified empire completely in the shadows, entirely free from my father's oppressive control and her toxic, relentless competition. Below the stage, the reality of the situation fully materialized. The church elders who had been fiercely whispering among themselves turned entirely away from my father. Elder Thomas practically shoved Deacon Marcus aside, loudly declaring that the police were already en route to investigate the stolen building funds. My father, stripped of his congregation, his dignity, and his carefully curated moral high ground, slumped into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. Bradley remained curled on the floor, weeping openly as his elite, wealthy parents marched out the grand double doors without looking back. They had completely abandoned him to his inevitable federal prison sentence. Brittany, the spoiled birthday girl, burst into loud theatrical tears, completely realizing her lavish lifestyle was permanently over. Her expensive crystal gowns suddenly looked like a cheap, tragic costume. The remaining elite guests, recognizing that associating with the Thornton family was now a massive social and legal liability, surged toward the exits in a chaotic, desperate stampede. They abandoned their expensive champagne flutes and untouched caviar appetizers, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Chloe dropped to her knees, the expensive fabric of her dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She looked up at me, her eyes completely devoid of the haughty arrogance that had defined her entire existence. She was utterly broken, stripped of her stolen wealth, her fake friends, and her stolen status. She was finally experiencing the exact same humiliation and isolation she had gleefully inflicted upon me for my entire life. I looked down at the pathetic remnants of my deeply toxic family. I felt no pity, no remorse, and absolutely no lingering obligation to save them from their own catastrophic choices. They had fully earned this devastating outcome by consistently choosing greed over basic human decency. I turned my head slightly and locked eyes with the towering head of security standing dutifully behind my shoulder. I gave him a single definitive nod. "Evict them!" I commanded, my voice projecting crisp and clear over the sobbing. "Shut down the music, turn on the lights. The party is over." The massive crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling blazed to life in a blinding, unforgiving glare. The romantic, dimly lit ambiance vanished instantly, exposing the absolute wreckage of the evening in stark illumination. The DJ hastily ripped the power cord from his soundboard, killing the bass track midway through a beat. The sudden heavy silence that replaced the music lasted only a fraction of a second before the sheer panic of the crowd completely shattered it. 300 elegantly dressed guests transformed into a frantic, shoving mob desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal currently unfolding on the stage. Women in restrictive beaded gowns abandoned their modesty, lifting their heavy skirts to sprint toward the main vestibule. Men in tailored tuxedos aggressively shoved each other out of the way, caring only about protecting their fragile reputations from impending legal fallout. The head of security signaled his team, and highly trained guards began systematically corralling the fleeing attendees toward the front doors, treating the wealthy elite like rowdy patrons at a cheap nightclub. Chloe remained crumpled on the cold hardwood floor, clutching the voluminous layers of her ruined dress. Her perfectly styled hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her face, completely destroyed by her own hysterical tears. The glamorous, untouchable socialite persona she had spent an entire decade viciously constructing had been utterly obliterated in less than 10 minutes. She was sobbing with such violent, racking gasps that she was practically choking on her own breath. She reached a trembling hand toward a passing country club acquaintance, begging for a ride home. But the woman merely sneered and quickened her pace, stepping right over the expensive gown to avoid any physical contact. My sister was finally experiencing the exact social isolation she had weaponized against me for our entire lives. She was completely alone, drowning in the public humiliation she had so arrogantly tried to orchestrate for me. To my left, the situation with my father was rapidly escalating from a quiet confrontation into a very hostile, aggressive mutiny. The church elders had completely surrounded him, forming an impenetrable wall of furious, righteous indignation. Elder Thomas, a man who had once treated my father with absolute reverence, was now jabbing his index finger forcefully into the man's chest. The elders demanded his immediate, unconditional resignation from the pulpit, loudly threatening to involve the regional synod and the state authorities before the night was over. His entire face was a terrible mottled shade of crimson. He was stammering, sweating profusely, and frantically trying to spin a narrative about clerical errors and accounting mistakes. The men who had faithfully served under his spiritual leadership for 30 years were not buying a single word of his desperate lies. They demanded the keys to his church office and ordered him to surrender his parish vehicle immediately. The supreme authority he had always wielded like a heavy, punishing club was stripped from him entirely, leaving him exposed as nothing more than a common, pathetic thief hiding behind a clerical collar. Amidst the overwhelming chaos, my sharp eyes caught a subtle, frantic movement near the edge of the room. Bradley was utilizing the massive distraction of my father being confronted to orchestrate a cowardly escape. He had abandoned his weeping wife on the floor and was currently creeping along the velvet wallpapered perimeter, heading straight for the discreet side exit leading to the catering kitchen. He moved with the desperate, pathetic urgency of a cornered rat constantly looking over his shoulder while keeping his head tucked low. He honestly thought he could simply slip away into the dark night, abandon his family to face the wrath of his defrauded investors, and somehow avoid the crushing consequences of his massive financial crimes. I signaled to a security guard to intercept him, but I decided I wanted the deep satisfaction of handling this specific confrontation myself. I descended the stage stairs with deliberate, measured steps, cutting a straight, unyielding path through the scattering crowd. His trembling hand was just reaching for the brass handle of the side door when I stepped firmly in front of him, blocking his only route to freedom. He gasped, jumping backward and nearly tripping over his own feet in his sheer panic. His face was slick with cold sweat, and his eyes darted wildly, searching for another viable exit. "Leaving so soon, Bradley?" I asked, my voice deadly calm against the roaring backdrop of the collapsing party. "You did not even try a slice of the magnificent birthday cake you stole for." He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously up and down quickly. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to summon the arrogant, condescending bravado he had always used to belittle my financial prudence. "Move out of my way, Maya," he hissed, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "You have done enough damage for one night. Let me pass before I call the police." "You want to call the police?" I asked, raising a single amused eyebrow. "That is incredibly proactive of you, Bradley. But you really do not need to bother dialing emergency services. They are incredibly efficient when properly motivated by massive wire fraud." I gestured casually toward the massive stained glass windows lining the front wall of the ballroom. The dark night outside was suddenly pierced by brilliant rotating flashes of stark red and blinding blue light. The chaotic noise inside the ballroom was instantly overwhelmed by the shrill wail of multiple approaching sirens. The heavy screech of tires skidding on the wet asphalt echoed loudly from the front circular driveway. Bradley spun around, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He stared in absolute horror as three large unmarked black SUVs forcefully hopped the curb and slammed into park directly in front of those massive glass doors. Heavily armed agents wearing tactical vests emblazoned with bright yellow FBI lettering began pouring out of the vehicles with terrifying coordinated speed. The ultimate reckoning had arrived. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom flew open with a deafening crash. A dozen federal agents stormed into the opulent space. The lead agent held up a laminated folder. Her voice cut through the remaining murmurs like a sharpened blade. She announced that they possessed a federal warrant for the immediate arrest of Bradley Thornton on multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. Bradley did not even attempt to run. His knees buckled instantly, sending him collapsing onto the polished floor. Two burly agents flanked him in seconds, hauling him upright. The sharp metallic click of heavy handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists echoed violently through the suddenly quiet room. Standing near the coat check, Bradley's elite country club parents watched the horrific spectacle unfold in sheer unadulterated horror. His aristocratic mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, completely unable to look away from the devastating sight of her perfect son being treated like a common criminal. His father leaned heavily against the mahogany coat counter, looking as though he might physically vomit. The pristine Thornton legacy was officially dead. My mother, Eleanor, had spent her adult life perfecting the role of the silent pastor's wife. She had mastered the art of looking the other way. Seeing her prized son-in-law in federal custody finally shattered her delicate artificial composure. She let out a guttural, terrifying screech that sounded more animal than human. She shoved her way past a bewildered catering waiter. Her face was flushed in angry purple, her eyes completely unhinged. She charged directly at the podium where I stood calmly observing the absolute wreckage of their lives. She raised her right hand, fully intending to slap me across the face. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not step back. I shot my left arm out and caught her frail wrist firmly in midair, stopping her frantic assault completely dead in its tracks. My grip was unyielding, completely locking her arm in place. She gasped in shock, struggling desperately to pull her hand free, but I held her tight. "You planned this," she screamed hysterically, spittle flying from her trembling lips. "You vicious, ungrateful girl! You ruined us! You destroyed your own family tonight!" I stared down at the woman who had watched me suffer for 3 decades without ever offering a single word of comfort. I felt absolutely no pity for her manufactured pain. "You ruined yourselves," I stated coldly, dropping her wrist as if touching her disgusted me. "I just turned on the lights." She stumbled backward, rubbing her arm and looking at me as if I were a terrifying monster she had never seen before. She had always demanded absolute silent obedience. Whenever Chloe stole my belongings or mocked my appearance, she softly reminded me that sisters simply go through phases. She had actively enabled their toxic, destructive behavior by demanding I constantly shrink myself to keep the peace. She demanded I absorb their endless abuse just so she could maintain the flawless illusion of a happy home. She had known about the missing church funds. I could see the undeniable truth written plainly in her panicked, shifting eyes. She had known my father was desperate for cash to cover his extensive gambling debts, and she had happily looked the other way when Bradley offered a highly illegal solution. She preferred funding her country club luncheons with stolen congregation money rather than facing reality. She was just as guilty as the men currently sweating in terror around her. The federal agents began marching Bradley toward the shattered front doors, practically dragging him as his legs refused to support his own weight. The flashing red and blue lights from the waiting SUVs painted his pale, terrified face in harsh neon colors. He was sweating profusely, his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket ruined by the rough handling of the arresting officers. He looked wildly around the room, his frantic gaze skipping over his weeping wife and landing directly on my father. Deacon Marcus was slowly edging toward the hallway leading to the restrooms, desperately trying to slip away unnoticed, while the authorities were focused entirely on his son-in-law. Bradley's eyes widened in sudden, vicious realization. He was going to federal prison, and the man who had happily spent the stolen money was trying to quietly walk away, completely scot-free. Bradley dug his expensive shoes into the floor, violently resisting the agents pulling him forward. He twisted his body around, facing the crowded ballroom with a crazed, desperate energy. "He helped me!" Bradley screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice raw and tearing. "Do not just arrest me! He was my direct accomplice!" Bradley pointed his shackled hands awkwardly toward the shadowy hallway, singling out the exact location where my father was attempting to hide. "Deacon Marcus authorized every single transfer," Bradley yelled, his voice echoing over the heavy thud of boots and the blaring sirens outside. "He gave me the digital routing numbers for the Emmanuel Church Building Fund. He deliberately laundered the money through the offshore accounts to hide his massive gambling debts. He took half the cash. I have the emails to prove it. He is a thief." The lead federal agent stopped dead in her tracks, her hand resting heavily on Bradley's shoulder. She slowly turned her head, her sharp, calculating eyes following the exact trajectory of Bradley's shaking, chained hands. The remaining federal agents stationed near the doors immediately shifted their tactical stances, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. The entire atmosphere in the room instantly transformed from a targeted arrest into a massive, expanding criminal investigation. The lead agent slowly released her strong grip on Bradley, handing him off to a subordinate officer. She turned her body completely around, her steely gaze locking onto the terrified, sweating man frozen near the restroom corridor. The federal agents turned their undivided, terrifying attention directly to Deacon Marcus. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the minimalist marble flooring. The city below was just beginning its morning ritual, a low hum of traffic and life that felt blissfully disconnected from the wreckage I had orchestrated just hours prior. I picked up my phone from the bedside table, the screen lighting up with a dizzying cascade of notifications. It was a digital archive of desperation. Over 100 missed calls and a seemingly endless queue of voicemails were waiting for my attention. I tapped the first one, my finger steady, and heard Chloe's voice immediately erupt into a shrill, incoherent screech. She was weeping, the sound wet and jagged, and she was blaming me for every single misfortune that had ever befallen her. She cursed me for the canceled credit cards, the sudden lack of access to her various socialite accounts, and the humiliating reality that her lavish lifestyle had vanished into thin air like smoke. Every word she uttered was a bitter, poisoned dart, but as I listened, I found that her toxicity no longer possessed the power to reach me. I moved into the kitchen, the soft clicking of my ceramic mug against the counter the only sound in the vast, quiet space. I set the phone on the island and let the voicemails play on speakerphone as I moved about the morning routine. Chloe screamed about her ruined social standing, the friends who had blocked her number, and the terrifying silence from the lawyers who had once crawled at her feet. She threatened me with every imaginable consequence, promising that if I did not fix her credit, did not explain this away to the authorities, and did not beg for her forgiveness, she would make me suffer. She rambled about the injustice of it all, her voice cracking as she claimed that I had never been the sister she deserved, that I had always been the blight on her perfect, golden path. I listened for a few moments longer, my expression entirely neutral as the coffee began to drip into the carafe. The woman on the other end was a stranger to me now, her demands for my obedience nothing more than the background noise of a life that no longer intersected with mine. The aroma of freshly ground dark roast began to fill the kitchen, a comforting, grounding scent that reminded me of how far I had traveled. My gaze drifted to the balcony, where the morning mist was clinging to the glass obscuring the horizon. Years ago, the sound of her voice, the venom in her accusations, and the sting of her rejection would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt. I would have spent the morning weeping obsessively, dissecting every word, and desperately searching for a way to bridge the chasm she had created. I would have felt the familiar crushing weight of inadequacy, believing that perhaps I really was the problem, that if I were just smarter or kinder or less successful, she would have finally accepted me. Now the silence that followed the end of her recording was not a void of pain, but a cathedral of peace. It was the absolute profound stillness of having nothing left to prove to people who were incapable of seeing my worth. I sipped the coffee, the heat radiating through me, and felt a quiet, powerful satisfaction. I had not just escaped, I had finally and completely outgrown them. The peace of the morning was shattered by a sharp, insistent rap at the heavy oak front door. I checked the time on the wall clock, curious about who would be seeking me out at such an ungodly hour. I walked toward the entrance, my silk robe flowing behind me, and peered through the security monitor. A man in a crisp navy uniform stood there holding a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with the heavy wax seal of the church. He was a professional courier, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. I deactivated the smart lock and swung the door open, the cool air of the hallway swirling in to meet the warmth of the apartment. He did not say a word, merely extended the package toward me and requested a digital signature on his handheld device. I tapped my name into the screen, took the heavy paper, and watched him turn on his heel and disappear back toward the elevator without a single pleasantry. I knew exactly what was inside before the seal even cracked under my thumb. I stepped back into the foyer and broke the heavy wax, revealing a thick stack of formal, high-quality stationery. The letterhead was unmistakably that of the Emmanuel Church Board of Directors. The text was drafted in the most formal, icy tone the head elder could muster, dripping with self-righteous gravity and legalistic jargon. They were conducting a formal emergency disciplinary tribunal to address the catastrophic revelations involving my father's theft of the building fund. The board had been forced into a corner by the overwhelming weight of the evidence I had provided to the police, and they were desperate to conduct a public purge to save whatever scrap of credibility they had remaining. The summons was not a request, it was a demand. They were officially ordering me to appear as the primary witness against my own father. They needed my testimony to solidify the case, to detail the offshore routing numbers, the forged ledgers, and the private conversations where he had bragged about siphoning the congregation's donations. My mind raced through the implications of the document, the weight of the paper feeling heavier with every sentence I parsed. This tribunal was clearly an attempt to distance themselves from his fraud, a way to throw him to the lions before the federal authorities could drag the entire institution down with him. They wanted me to be the weapon they used to destroy him, a role I was arguably the most qualified to fill, given my intimate knowledge of his greed. I walked back to the kitchen island and laid the summons down beside my phone, which was once again lighting up with frantic incoming calls from my mother. The irony of the situation was sharp enough to cut. The very institution that had been used to shame me for my refusal to submit was now begging me to facilitate its preservation. They had once demanded my silence as a matter of faith, and now they demanded my speech as a matter of survival. I looked at the summons, then at the city skyline beyond the windows. The game was no longer being played on their terms, and the power dynamic had completely shifted. They were not inviting me to a discussion. They were inviting me to oversee the final public execution of the man who had preached absolute truth while living a life of total deceit. I reached out, picked up a pen from the counter, and began to write my response, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of victory in the movement of my hand. The tribunal was coming, and I was going to be the one to set the terms of his downfall. The heavy arched oak doors of the sanctuary creaked open as I entered, the sound echoing through the cavernous vaulted hall like a gavel strike. My mother Eleanor was already stationed at the altar, her posture hunched and her face a meticulously crafted mask of shattered maternal despair. She was surrounded by a small, skeptical group of deacons and trustees, clutching a lace handkerchief as she recounted a completely fabricated version of events. She sobbed that I had always been the volatile, deeply troubled child, the one who had finally snapped under the weight of her own professional failures. She spun a harrowing theatrical tale about me hatching a cold-blooded, vindictive plot to dismantle my father's ministry simply because I could not cope with my own intense, irrational jealousy of his holy status. She claimed the financial records were clever, malicious forgeries designed by a daughter who had spent years obsessively nursing a baseless, toxic grudge against the only people who had ever truly loved her. The deacons shifted uncomfortably, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and genuine mounting concern. They had known me since I was a child. They knew my character was the exact antithesis of the chaotic, unstable monster she was describing. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking with deliberate, rhythmic precision on the stone floor. I did not offer a single word of rebuttal to her dramatic performance. I didn't raise my voice or plead my case. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and withdrew a small, sleek, encrypted USB drive. I stepped up to the massive, polished altar, my presence radiating a calm, absolute authority that forced the room into an uneasy silence. I placed the drive directly into the palm of the lead elder, a man who had been my father's closest confidant for over 2 decades. "Everything you need to know about the building fund is on this drive," I stated, my voice echoing clearly against the high rafters. "It contains every unredacted bank record, every private server email, and the exact timestamps of every fraudulent transfer. You will find that my father didn't just know about the transfers. He initiated every single one of them with his own secure credentials." My father, who had been standing to the side with his eyes closed in feigned prayer, opened them wide at the mention of the digital evidence. The color drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly, translucent shade of gray. He looked at the USB drive as if it were a live grenade. He had assumed I would have been smart enough to destroy my own leverage to protect the family name, but he had drastically underestimated my foresight. He watched the lead elder retreat to the vestry with the drive, knowing full well that his 30-year facade was about to be burned to the ground. Desperation clawed at his throat. He looked around the room, frantically searching for a way to maintain his waning control, and his gaze landed on the physical folder he had kept tucked inside his desk for months. It was the equity paper I had foolishly signed during a moment of weakness, back when I had foolishly believed he was still my father, the man who had promised to protect me. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of his panic. He lunged toward the table, fumbling to pull the legal document from his briefcase. He held it up, shaking it violently at the board of directors, as if it were a holy relic. "I still hold the deed to her house!" He bellowed, his eyes wide and unhinged. "She signed the equity agreement back in March. This house is worth over $2 million. I will sell it immediately to repay the church. I will use her assets to cover the losses, and that will prove I am not a thief." He was clinging to this final pathetic lifeline with the desperate strength of a drowning man. He believed that if he could just force me to sacrifice my last standing asset, he could buy back the forgiveness of the board and preserve his standing. He wanted to strip me of my shelter just to keep his own seat of power secure for one more day. Before the lead elder could reach the office, the heavy side door of the sanctuary swung open, admitting a gust of cold air and the sharp professional presence of my primary legal counsel. Mr. Sterling did not look like a man who enjoyed theatrics, yet he moved through the space with the undeniable predatory grace of a shark entering a pool of wounded prey. He carried a leather-bound briefcase that looked like it held 1,000 years of bad news for my father. He stopped right beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder in a silent, grounding gesture of support. He did not look at my father. He looked directly at the board members, his eyes hard and uncompromising. He had arrived exactly when he was needed, armed with the final piece of the puzzle that would ensure my father never held a position of authority again. "Good morning, gentlemen," Mr. Sterling announced, his voice dripping with smooth, lethal professionalism. "I am Maya's attorney. I understand my client's father is currently attempting to leverage a piece of property that he falsely claims is his to sign over." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, then reached into his briefcase and produced a certified copy of a court injunction. "My client successfully filed for a full cancellation of that equity agreement 3 weeks ago. The document my client's father is holding is now nothing more than a scrap of invalid paper entirely without legal weight. Attempting to sell property that does not belong to him, based on a document that was legally voided by a court of law, would be a very grave error on his part. My father's hand dropped the paper fluttering to the floor, as if the air had been suddenly sucked out of it. He looked at Mr. Sterling, then at me, realizing he was completely, utterly boxed in. There was no escape, no bluff, and no forgiveness left to barter with. My mother had gone silent, her theatrics finally failing to find an audience. The board members, seeing the court injunction, realized they were on the precipice of being implicated in a massive public fraud if they stood by him for even another minute. They didn't even look at him as they turned to leave the room. The tribunal had officially begun, and my father was the only defendant left standing in the wreckage of his own design. I adjusted my blazer, feeling the cool, steady pulse of absolute control. The church, the money, the house, and the narrative were finally fully mine. I had simply turned on the lights, and the monsters had nowhere left to hide. I watched as my father tried to stand, his legs shaking violently, finally understanding that his reign was over. The game had concluded, and he had lost everything he had ever pretended to care about. Mr. Sterling adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses, his gaze fixed on the trembling man before him. My father's chest heaved as he frantically flattened the crumpled equity document against the polished wood of the altar, his desperate fingers tracing the ink of my signature. He refused to accept his defeat, insisting loudly that a signature was a binding contract, regardless of any sudden court injunctions. He barked at the deacons to look at the ink, claiming it was ironclad proof of my financial subservience. Mr. Sterling did not raise his voice. Instead, my attorney calmly unclasped his leather briefcase and withdrew a pristine folder containing the authenticated master copy of the exact same agreement. He stepped forward, laying the authentic paperwork directly over my father's trembling hands. The crisp snap of the parchment echoed like a gunshot in the silent sanctuary. Mr. Sterling tapped a manicured finger against the bottom of the third page, right where an inconspicuous block of text rested just above the signature line. The lawyer explained with icy precision that the document my father had forced me to sign under extreme duress weeks ago was never a standard equity transfer. He pointed out the specific legal addendum that I had secretly drafted and seamlessly inserted into the packet before putting pen to paper. My father had been so blinded by his own greed and so utterly convinced of my submission that he had not bothered to read the fine print. He had simply assumed I was signing over the deed to my $2 million home to save his reputation. In reality, the revised clause completely inverted the nature of the transaction. Mr. Sterling's voice cut through the stagnant air of the church, detailing how the altered text explicitly redefined the transfer as a debt settlement agreement rather than a property handover. The color completely drained from my father's face, as his eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal jargon he had previously ignored. His lips moved silently, forming the words that were actively sealing his financial ruin right there on the altar. He looked up at me, his expression a mixture of profound confusion and rising terror. I stared back at him with absolute, unwavering resolve. Years ago, when I was just starting to build my business, I had applied for a crucial commercial loan, only to be denied due to a catastrophic credit score. It took months of agonizing investigation to uncover the truth. My holy, righteous father had fraudulently used my social security number to open a dozen high-limit credit cards, maxing them out to cover his mounting gambling debts while hiding behind his pastoral collar. He had stolen my identity and nearly destroyed my future before it even began, assuming I would never have the resources or the courage to trace the financial wreckage back to him. I had never confronted him about the identity theft, choosing instead to absorb the damage, rebuild my credit from scratch, and wait for the perfect moment to collect what was rightfully mine. I had spent the last 5 years quietly tracking his financial maneuvers, meticulously mapping the web of his hidden liabilities. Through a shell corporation, I had systematically purchased the mounting debt of his own sprawling estate. I bought the secondary mortgages he had secretly taken out to fund his lifestyle, consolidating them under a single unyielding entity that I entirely controlled. The document he had so eagerly pushed across the table for me to sign was the ultimate trap. By affixing his own signature as the counterparty to my addendum, he had legally confessed to the past identity theft in writing. The contract explicitly stipulated that in exchange for not pursuing federal criminal charges for the historical fraud, he was voluntarily surrendering the deed to his own mansion to clear the massive debt he owed me. He had literally signed away his own home while thinking he was stealing mine. The trap had been sprung with his own pen, fueled entirely by his endless appetite for other people's money. My mother, who had been listening to Mr. Sterling's methodical explanation with widening eyes, finally grasped the catastrophic reality of the situation. Her pristine, artificially maintained world was disintegrating before her very eyes. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her throat as the truth settled over her. She lunged forward, grabbing my father by the lapels of his expensive suit, shaking him with a sudden violent rage. She shrieked at him, demanding to know how he could have been so incredibly stupid, how he could have lost their beautiful home, and how he could have allowed his despised daughter to outsmart him so thoroughly. The veneer of the supportive pastor's wife vanished entirely, replaced by the vicious fury of a woman realizing her country club lifestyle had just been legally revoked. She turned her venomous glare toward me, opening her mouth to hurl another barrage of insults, but the sheer, silent authority radiating from the disgusted church elders stopped her dead in her tracks. The deacons and trustees watched the pathetic display with absolute revulsion. The man they had trusted to lead their congregation was currently weeping over his lost mansion, exposing his profound corruption and staggering incompetence for all to see. They stepped back from the altar, physically distancing themselves from the toxic wreckage of my parents' marriage. There was no sympathy left in the room, only the cold, harsh light of accountability. My father fell to his knees, his hands clutching the edge of the altar as he wept for the loss of his material wealth. He did not shed a single tear for the daughter he had abused, the congregation he had robbed, or the faith he had mocked. I stepped closer to his trembling form, my shadow engulfing him entirely, and I leaned down so my voice would be the only thing left behind. "You don't own my house, Dad," Maya says softly. "I own yours, and your eviction notice is already posted on the front door." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a beached fish, unable to draw a single breath of air into his deflated lungs. The realization that he had literally signed away his own sanctuary to the daughter he had spent a lifetime terrorizing finally shattered his remaining composure. He dropped his face into his trembling hands, a pathetic whimpering sound escaping his throat. My mother remained frozen in her tracks, her manicured hands still gripping his ruined lapels, her eyes wide with the horrifying understanding that she was now effectively homeless. I did not stay to watch them weep over the loss of their material idols. I turned on my heel, Mr. Sterling falling into step beside me, and walked out of the sanctuary. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us, sealing my parents inside the tomb of their own making. The crisp morning air hit my face, carrying the sweet, undeniable scent of total liberation. Exactly 48 hours later, the dust from the explosion was still settling over the city. I was seated behind the sprawling, polished obsidian desk in my private wealth management office. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind me framed the towering skyline, a fitting backdrop for the empire I had quietly built from the ashes of their abuse. The sleek, modern design of the suite was a testament to my hard-won success, a quiet fortress of absolute control. My assistant, a sharp and fiercely efficient woman named Sarah, was finalizing the morning portfolio reviews when a sudden violent commotion erupted in the reception area. The heavy glass doors to my suite were shoved open with a jarring crash. Two security guards were hot on the intruder's heels, their hands reaching out to restrain the frantic woman who had just bulldozed her way past the front desk. I raised a single hand, signaling the guards to stand down. They stopped immediately, stepping back, but remaining on high alert. The intruder stood gasping in the center of the plush Persian rug, and it took me a full 3 seconds to recognize my own sister. Chloe looked absolutely unrecognizable. The flawless golden child who had spent her entire existence wrapped in custom designer labels and effortless arrogance was entirely gone. Her expensive blonde blowout was a tangled, greasy mess plastered to the sides of her pale face. The beige cashmere trench coat she wore was severely wrinkled and stained, looking exactly as if she had slept in it on a park bench. Her eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by deep purple bags and the smeared remnants of waterproof mascara. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as she darted her panicked gaze around my opulent office, clearly struggling to reconcile the immense wealth surrounding her with the sister she had always deemed a pathetic failure. The sheer desperation radiating from her was a palpable foul odor. Her perfectly curated world had violently collapsed, leaving her exposed and utterly defenseless. "Maya!" She gasped, her voice a ragged, desperate rasp that scraped against the quiet elegance of the room. "You have to help me. Please, you have to help me right now." She stumbled forward, ignoring the warning glance from the security guards, and stopped just inches from my desk. The federal authorities had moved with terrifying speed. She blurted out that Bradley's accounts had been completely frozen the moment he was processed into federal custody. The government had seized their offshore assets, locked down their joint checking accounts, and placed a hard freeze on her personal credit cards. Yesterday evening, federal agents had arrived at her sprawling mansion with a seizure notice giving her exactly 1 hour to pack a single bag before changing the locks. She had spent the night calling every single one of her elite country club friends, only to discover that her number had been universally blocked. She was a pariah, a toxic liability, and completely destitute. "I have nothing," she sobbed, the tears carving fresh tracks through her ruined makeup. "My cards are declining everywhere. I cannot even buy a cup of coffee. Bradley's lawyers will not return my calls because I cannot pay their retainers. I need a loan, Maya. Just a few $100,000. Just enough to secure a defense attorney and get a luxury rental until this all blows over. We are family. You have all this money. You have to help your sister." She gestured wildly around the luxurious office, her greed momentarily flashing through her terror. She still believed she was entitled to my resources simply by virtue of sharing my bloodline. When I did not immediately reach for my checkbook, the last remnants of her pride simply evaporated. Chloe's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the floor, her hands gripping the polished edge of my desk, as she wept openly, begging for salvation from the very person she had spent 30 years destroying. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet, searching my own heart for even a single ounce of pity. I found absolutely none. I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers as I studied her pathetic, broken form. "Alone?" I stated, my voice cold and flat, echoing off the glass walls. "You want me to hand you hundreds of thousands of dollars to maintain your lifestyle. You want me to finance your comfort while your husband sits in a federal holding cell for stealing money from a church. The audacity is genuinely staggering." I let the silence stretch, forcing her to endure the agonizing weight of my scrutiny. "I recall a very different conversation not too long ago. I remember sitting at a restaurant while you laughed in my face and demanded I pay a $9,600 dinner bill for food I did not eat. When I told you I could not afford it, you looked me dead in the eye and told me to get a job. You mocked my struggles, ridiculed my career, and demanded I shrink myself to subsidize your arrogance. You gleefully watched me suffer. Now you are crawling on my floor begging for a handout." Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing harder, her fingernails digging into the wood of my desk. "I was wrong," she wailed, her voice cracking with a high-pitched hysteria. "I was so wrong, Maya. I am sorry. I will do anything. I just cannot live on the streets. I have never had to struggle. Please do not do this to me." Her apology was entirely hollow, born out of survival instinct rather than genuine remorse. She was not sorry for abusing me. She was simply terrified of the consequences of her own actions. She was mourning the loss of her credit limit, not the loss of her sister. I slowly opened the top drawer of my desk and withdrew a crisp single-page document. I placed it on the desk and smoothed it out with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I picked up a heavy silver pen and set it precisely next to the paper. "I will not give you a dime," I said, my tone slicing through her hysterical sobs like a freshly sharpened blade. I will not fund your legal defense, and I will certainly not pay for a luxury apartment. Chloe gasped, her head dropping forward, as if I had physically struck her. However, I continued sliding the contract across the dark wood until it rested directly in front of her gripping hands. I will offer you a job. It is a minimum wage cleaning position at the Grand Crest Estate. You will scrub the floors, clean the toilets, and take out the trash. The shifts are 12 hours long, and the housing provided is a small, unair-conditioned room above the maintenance garage. Take it or leave it. Chloe stared at the contract in absolute, unadulterated horror. The Grand Crest Estate was the pinnacle of elite luxury, a place she had once frequented as a VIP guest. Now I was offering her the chance to return as the lowest-ranking servant. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for a reprieve that would never come. Seeing the icy, unyielding resolve in my stare, she finally understood that her golden life was dead and buried. With a shaking, defeated hand, Chloe reached up and took the pen. The scratch of the pen sounded deafening in the quiet office. Chloe hastily scrawled her signature on the bottom line, the ink trembling with the erratic motion of her shaking hand. I pulled the contract across the desk, inspected the sloppy cursive to ensure it was legally binding, and placed it neatly into a sleek leather folder. I informed my sister that her first shift at the Grand Crest Estate began at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, and that tardiness would result in immediate termination without cause. She did not argue or attempt to bargain further. She simply rose to her feet, her shoulders slumped in total defeat, and shuffled out of my office without a single backward glance. The immediate destruction of her personal life was only the opening act of a much wider systematic social execution. The elite Atlanta high society circle they had clawed their way into was an ecosystem built entirely upon the preservation of a flawless public image. To survive in that rarefied air required absolute perfection, and my family had just become the ultimate cautionary tale. The fallout was swift, absolute, and ruthlessly efficient. Within exactly 48 hours of my father's public disgrace at the church tribunal, their names were permanently scrubbed from every exclusive guest list in the metropolitan area. The prestigious country club where my mother had hosted her lavish charity luncheons quietly revoked their membership, citing a violation of their morality clause. The prominent families who had once flooded their home for holiday galas now treated them like highly infectious lepers. My parents and my sister were officially social pariahs, completely cut off from the wealthy, influential network they had worshipped their entire lives. My mother discovered the extent of her exile the hard way. Refusing to accept that her reign was over, she had dressed in her finest tailored Chanel suit and attempted to attend the annual Jack and Jill alumni brunch, acting as though the swirling rumors were simply the jealous whispers of lesser women. She walked up to the grand entrance of the Georgian Terrace Hotel, fully expecting the velvet ropes to part for her as they always had. Instead, the chapter president intercepted her in the lobby, flanking her with 2 private security guards. In front of a dozen of her closest friends, my mother was quietly but firmly told that her presence was no longer welcome. Her table assignment had been given to someone else, and her immediate departure was required to prevent a scene. Her former friends averted their eyes, pretending to be fascinated by their champagne flutes, as my mother was unceremoniously escorted out the revolving doors. My mother possessed a terrifying inability to accept defeat. For her, the loss of her social standing was a fate worse than death itself, and she absolutely refused to fade quietly into the shadows of obscurity. Deprived of her country club audience and shunned by the congregation she had manipulated for decades, she decided to seek out a much larger platform. She contacted a producer at the most prominent local news network, pitching a salacious, highly dramatic story of elder abuse and familial betrayal. She knew exactly how to weaponize white middle-class sympathy, styling herself as the devoted, heartbroken pastor's wife, whose entire existence had been ruthlessly decimated by a vindictive, mentally unstable daughter. I sat at my mahogany desk and watched the promotional preview for the 6 o'clock evening broadcast play across my secondary monitor. The camera framed my mother perfectly, capturing the strategic lack of makeup and the deeply woven lines of manufactured distress around her eyes. She clutched a crumpled tissue, her voice wavering with practiced theatrical precision as she painted me as a greedy corporate monster who had stolen her home out of pure spite. She completely omitted the offshore accounts, the stolen church building funds, and the fraudulent equity documents. Instead, she spun a harrowing fiction about a daughter consumed by irrational jealousy, begging the community for their prayers, and more importantly, their financial support. A vibrant banner flashed across the bottom of the television screen, displaying a link to a crowdfunding campaign she had launched to save her family from impending homelessness. Watching her weep on high-definition television triggered a visceral memory of her historical manipulation tactics. Whenever reality threatened to expose her, she simply rewrote the narrative to cast herself as the martyr. When I was 17 and suffered a severe bout of pneumonia that landed me in the hospital for 2 weeks, she did not spend her time comforting me. She spent those 14 days holding court in the hospital cafeteria, soaking up the endless sympathy of her church friends as she lamented the terrible emotional toll my illness was taking on her. She possessed a predatory instinct for harvesting pity and converting it into social currency. Seeing her deploy that exact same strategy on a citywide news broadcast felt less like an insult and more like a deeply predictable pattern. She genuinely believed that if she could just cry hard enough on camera, the public would open their wallets and fund her redemption arc. She thought the television interview was her ultimate trump card, a brilliant maneuver to regain her lost fortune while simultaneously destroying my professional reputation in the process. She assumed I would scramble to issue a defensive statement or hide from the inevitable public backlash. I felt no panic as the clip looped. I reached out and tapped the spacebar on my keyboard, freezing the video exactly on the frame of her tear-stained, calculating face. She had desperately wanted a massive audience, and I was more than willing to ensure she received one. I picked up my encrypted smartphone and bypassed my standard contacts, scrolling down to a highly secure number I had kept on standby for the past 3 months. The man on the other end was a relentless, globally celebrated investigative journalist known for dismantling corporate fraud and exposing corrupt religious institutions. I had been quietly feeding him anonymous verified breadcrumbs regarding the Emmanuel Church financial discrepancies for weeks, priming him for the inevitable explosion. Now my mother had conveniently provided the perfect sensational catalyst for his exclusive exposé. He answered on the second ring, sounding quite alert. I skipped all the usual pleasantries. I told him that the grieving pastor's wife, currently dominating the local news promos, was actively soliciting donations under fraudulent pretenses. I promised him exclusive, unrestricted access to the complete financial ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the signed legal confessions detailing the identity theft. I informed him that the story was no longer just about a disgraced church elder, but a coordinated, ongoing criminal conspiracy involving interstate wire fraud. He asked how quickly I could send the files over to his secure server. I smiled at my frozen monitor, clicked the send button on my prepared email draft, and told him to check his inbox. The gravel crunched beneath the heavy tires of my SUV as I turned into the sweeping driveway of the grand estate. The sprawling brick mansion, once the ultimate symbol of my parents' untouchable status and ruthless ambition, now stood as a silent monument to their ruin. Parked awkwardly in front of the towering columns was a battered rented moving truck. Its faded orange and white logo clashed violently with the manicured emerald green hedges and the imported marble fountain bubbling apathetically in the center of the courtyard. I killed the engine and stepped out into the crisp morning air, buttoning my tailored wool coat against the sudden chill. I did not come here today to hurl insults or demand apologies. I was simply the legal owner executing a standard court-ordered eviction on a defaulted property. The transition of power was no longer a theoretical debate, it was a matter of physical, undeniable reality. Walking up the wide, sweeping steps to the main entrance, I found the massive mahogany doors propped wide open. Inside the vaulted foyer, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of the chaotic, shrill theatrics that had defined my mother's entire existence. There were no camera crews, no dramatic wails for sympathy, and no frantic attempts to rewrite the narrative. The silence was heavy, thick, and suffocating. My father emerged from the formal dining room carrying a taped cardboard box marked with a black Sharpie. His tailored suits and arrogant swagger had vanished, replaced by a pair of faded slacks and an oversized, wrinkled sweater. His shoulders were deeply stooped, pulled down by the invisible crushing weight of his public excommunication and total financial collapse. The man who had once stood at church altars bellowing demands for respect now looked terribly frail, a hollowed-out shell stripped of his stolen authority. He did not look at me. He simply shuffled past, his gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of his loafers, and carried his meager belongings out to the waiting truck. My mother appeared moments later dragging a heavy rolling suitcase across the polished hardwood floors she used to obsessively guard from scuff marks. The transformation in her appearance was startling. The immaculate salon fresh hair and flawlessly applied cosmetics were gone, exposing the deep, harsh lines of a woman who had aged 2 decades in the span of a week. Her face was pale tight and etched with the bitter, inescapable realization that the high society circle she had worshipped had permanently locked her out. The wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress were currently ignoring her calls, entirely unwilling to associate with convicted fraudsters. She paused at the threshold of the grand entryway, her hands gripping the plastic handle of her luggage so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a brief second, our eyes met. There was no fire left in her stare, no venom waiting to be unleashed, and no righteous indignation to hurl in my direction. There was only the cold, barren void of a complete and total defeat. She lowered her head in silent submission, stepping around me to follow my father out the door. I stood in the center of the echoing foyer, watching them load the last of their permitted personal items into the back of the rented vehicle. I felt no urge to gloat over their misery or relish in their spectacular downfall. The anger that had fueled me for years had simply evaporated, leaving behind a pristine, crystalline clarity. I signaled to the private locksmith I had hired, who had been waiting quietly near his van. He immediately moved to the front entrance, his drill humming as he began the mechanical process of replacing the deadbolts. The metallic grinding noise echoed through the empty halls, a definitive soundtrack to the end of their reign. Every lock on the property was being changed systematically, sealing off their access to the luxury they had stolen from others. I watched the brass tumblers fall to the floor, replaced by fresh, shining steel. I was securing my asset, protecting my investment, and locking the past firmly behind a reinforced door. Outside, the heavy metal door of the moving truck slammed shut with a resounding, hollow thud. The engine sputtered to life, coughing a cloud of gray exhaust into the suburban air. I stood on the top step of the porch, my hands resting casually in my coat pockets, and watched as the truck slowly lurched down the long, winding driveway. They did not wave goodbye, and they did not look back in the rearview mirrors. They simply drove away, carrying the heavy wreckage of their shattered lives toward a bleak, uncertain future. As the truck turned onto the main road and disappeared from view, a profound, overwhelming sense of closure washed over me. The invisible toxic cord that had tethered me to their endless cycle of abuse, manipulation, and conditional love was finally permanently severed. I breathed in deeply, the air tasting cleaner and lighter than it had in decades. The estate, the wealth, and the peace were finally mine, uncontested and secure. I turned away from the driveway, pulling the collar of my coat tighter, fully prepared to head back to the city and resume my life. The chapter was closed. But as I moved toward my parked SUV, a slight movement near the edge of the manicured hedgerow caught my attention. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the tall oak trees, hesitating on the edge of the gravel path. It was my 16-year-old niece, Brittany, Chloe's eldest daughter. She was wearing a faded denim jacket and clutching a heavily stuffed olive green duffel bag to her chest with a white-knuckled grip. Her eyes were wide, darting nervously between my face and the empty road where her grandparents had just vanished. She trembled slightly in the cold wind, taking a slow, terrifyingly uncertain step in my direction, as if I were her very last hope. The crunch of gravel beneath her worn sneakers broke the heavy silence of the courtyard. Brittany closed the distance between us, her head bowed and her shoulders hunched against the biting chill of the morning air. She dropped the olive green duffel bag at her feet, the heavy canvas sagging against the pavement. This was not the arrogant, brand-obsessed teenager who used to mock my sensible clothes and modest apartment. The haughty sneer she had inherited directly from her mother was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, terrified vulnerability of a child waking up from a long, suffocating nightmare. She had packed only the barest essentials, leaving the designer handbags and expensive jewelry behind. She looked up at me, her mascara smeared beneath bloodshot eyes, and her lower lip quivered. She confessed that she had hidden behind the hedgerow when the moving truck arrived because she absolutely refused to get inside it. She told me she had spent the last 3 days listening to her parents frantically screaming at each other, blaming everyone else for the catastrophic consequences of their own criminal actions. The federal indictments, the offshore accounts, the stolen church funds, Brittany had heard all of it. She apologized for her past behavior, her voice breaking as she admitted how deeply ashamed she was of the cruelty she had participated in. She realized the horrifying truth about the hollow fake prestige her parents had built their lives upon, and she was desperate to escape the inevitable wreckage. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks as she explicitly begged me for genuine help. She did not ask for a credit card, a luxury car, or a return to the country club elite status she had grown up worshipping. She simply asked for a way out of the generational toxicity that had just decimated her entire family. She wanted to finish her education, get a real job, and learn how to survive without relying on fraud or manipulation. She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, waiting for my judgment. Watching her tremble on the driveway, I felt a sudden sharp ache in my chest. I did not see the spoiled daughter of my vindictive sister. I saw a frightened, desperate version of my younger self. I recognized the suffocating weight of being trapped inside a family that valued superficial optics over basic human decency. When I was her age, I had silently prayed for a lifeline, for just one rational adult, to pull me out of the psychological war zone my mother had created. No one had ever come to my rescue. I had been forced to claw my way out of the darkness entirely on my own, building my armor piece by piece. Now, standing in the shadow of the estate I had legally seized, I possessed the power to be the exact lifeline I had once so desperately needed. I looked at her tear-stained face and made a quiet, definitive choice to break the cycle. I stepped forward and placed a steady, reassuring hand on her trembling shoulder. I told her I would help her, but I made it abundantly clear that my assistance came with absolute non-negotiable conditions. There would be no designer allowances, no luxury apartments, and zero tolerance for the elitist mindset her mother had spent 16 years drilling into her head. I promised to pay her full tuition for the local community college and cover the rent for a modest, safe one-bedroom apartment near the campus. In exchange, she was required to secure a part-time job, maintain a strict budget, and earn her own spending money through actual hard work. She had to learn the value of a dollar earned honestly, far away from the toxic influence of the high society circle that had ruined her parents. Brittany did not hesitate or attempt to negotiate the terms of my offer. She had finally chosen reality over the comfortable illusion of her mother's crumbling empire. She lunged forward, wrapping her arms tightly around my waist as she sobbed out profound, genuine gratitude into my coat. I pulled out my phone and dialed my private driver, instructing him to take her to a secure temporary hotel suite I kept on retainer. I watched her climb into the sleek black town car, leaving her meager belongings in the trunk. She looked back at me through the tinted window, her face glowing with the unmistakable light of a brand new beginning. With Brittany safely on her way to a better life, I finally turned my attention back to the Grand Crest estate. I walked slowly up the marble staircase and pushed through the mahogany doors, stepping into the silent foyer. The oppressive, chaotic energy that had plagued this house for decades was completely gone, scrubbed clean by the harsh, brilliant light of accountability. I moved through the echoing corridors, admiring the stunning architecture and the exquisite craftsmanship that I legally owned. I climbed the grand curving staircase to the master suite and stepped out onto the private balcony. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the expansive sky in brilliant fiery shades of crimson gold and deep violet. I poured myself a glass of vintage red wine from the private cellar and leaned against the cool stone balustrade. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the gardens. A gentle, refreshing breeze swept across the manicured lawns, rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees. I took a slow, deep sip of the rich wine, savoring the complex flavors as I looked out over my immaculate, uncontested kingdom. My encrypted smartphone rested on the patio table beside me, blissfully permanently silent. There were no manipulative text messages, no frantic demands for money, and no manufactured emergencies. I possessed immense wealth, total autonomy, and absolute peace. The ultimate sweetest revenge was simply living my best life, completely free and utterly untouchable.